Warning, this episode could be triggering. Viewer discretion is advised. When people first start out with an AR, adding an optic is usually the first thing everyone does. Eventually, as you get better at shooting, you might find that the standard mil-spec trigger is holding you back a little bit. Fortunately for America's favorite rifle, there are tons of excellent options. Larue and Geissele are two of my favorite brands, and I want to talk about two of their triggers in particular that most shooters seem to fixate on. Touch on how single and two-stage triggers are different, and where the price of a trigger hits the point of diminishing returns. The trigger is your primary interface with your rifle and plays a large role in how consistently you can shoot with your rifle. The trigger on its own is not going to automatically make you a more accurate. You can be accurate with a super heavy double action revolver if you practice enough. What it does make it easier to do is be consistent and have a consistent trigger pull when your sights are aligned with the target, especially in more stressful situations like a competition or defensive shooting. A mil-spec trigger is absolutely fine. In fact, by any metric, the standard AR-15 trigger is a good trigger, especially when you compare it to a lot of its historical contemporaries. The European battle rifle guys know what I'm talking about. But a high-end trigger is going to give you a more clearly defined wall, a cleaner break, and significantly reduced creep and over travel. Let's take a look at the Larue first. These triggers can usually be found for around $100 various places online, either with the curved or a flat-faced trigger. The main parts are made out of S7 tool steel, and it's a two-stage trigger with a total pull weight of roughly 4.5 pounds. The first stage being about 2.5 and the second stage break at about 2 pounds. From the factory, it also includes an optional heavy spring, raising the pull to 6 pounds if you like a less sensitive trigger. Personally, I don't. I am very much of the school of thought that your finger shouldn't be on the trigger unless you're planning on shooting, and a heavier trigger isn't a safety feature, but some people like it. Here's the trigger installed in my featureless competition rifle. Featureless is a California thing. Don't worry about it. I'll talk about that setup another time. Rifle's clear. Take the trigger back to the wall. And then the break. Pretty light break, real easy. The reset, bracket, just let off a little bit, very short reset, and then ready to go again. I really like this trigger. The Larue is a trigger that would be perfectly at home in a defensive carbine, a longer range setup, or a dedicated competition gun, and it's really hard to argue with the price point. And speaking of price point, Geissele triggers tend to cost more. Some of them way more, like the Super Select Fire or their competition-focused options. I happen to have an SSA-E here because this is my favorite trigger. As of the current year, 2025, you can usually find them on sale for around $150. Like the Larue, it's a two-stage trigger machined out of S7 tool steel, but it has a lighter take-up around 2.5 pounds and a final break around 1 or so. Also, unlike Larue, Geissele makes triggers for the US military if you care about that. You may ask why I'm not comparing it to the SSA, which has a similar trigger pull weight, to which I say, well, I don't have one handy and it's basically the same trigger anyway. Here's the trigger installed in a fixed mag setup because, well, California again. I'll talk about this setup another time. Rifle's clear. Here's the trigger. Take that right back to the wall. Very obvious wall, no mush or anything like that. Trigger breaks. It honestly feels like a glass rod snapping to me. The SSA-E is also a lighter trigger than the Larue, so that might be helping a little bit there, but if there was any teeny little bit of gritty feeling in the Larue, there isn't any with the Geissele. Let's check that reset. Very short reset. Probably a hair shorter than the Larue, but I don't think it would make a huge difference if you're just mag dumping on a stage. And there it goes again. At the end of the day, both of these triggers are a massive improvement over the mil-spec trigger. Well, I just got back from taking these two guys to the range. This one has the Geissele and this one has the Larue. And I have to say, the Larue is probably 95, 98% of the trigger that the Geissele is for, I mean, you can get them for under $100 when they're on sale. The Black Friday deals go crazy. The only real appreciable difference I really noticed personally when I was shooting, I ran a couple of bill drills and did some other fun stuff out there. The Larue has a slightly heavier trigger that I wasn't completely used to, having shot the Geissele for so many years now. And really, once you get used to the slightly different point in which the trigger breaks, your splits are just as fast, the reset's fine, you don't notice it, you can go to town. The biggest difference I honestly noticed between these two guns is this one's relative light and running it with a muzzle brake since it's a featureless build. That time I tended to overdrive the gun a little bit, but you know, that's just a learned behavior. This is new, I'm still getting used to it. Honestly, you know, you can get the Larue and it's going to be fantastic. Do with this information what you will. If I was doing like a dedicated long range build or SPR kind of setup, I'd probably go with the Geissele over the Larue, but really that's just because the trigger breaks at like 1 pound on the final stage, and that makes some of those long range shots, shooting from weird positions and trying to minimize any movement on the rifle at all, a little bit easier. But that's entirely subjective and will, you know, be up to you when you're shooting the gun. Now, I'll just touch on two-stage versus single-stage triggers, since all I've got to hand is the mil-spec example, which, as we've discussed, isn't going to be anywhere near as good as the aftermarket options we've talked about. My personal preference is for the two-stage triggers, particularly the Geissele SSA-E, since I like the ability to take up that first stage and just have that very light final stage break for precise shots at a distance, which can be really handy if someone decided to put tiny little 3-inch wide targets out at 100 yards on a competition stage. From my personal experience, I can definitely say that there is a vast performance difference between using a stock mil-spec trigger and the Geissele SSA-E for that. Now, if you're going for maximum speed and the fastest split times, you may want one of the fancier single-stage triggers on the market. You can absolutely shoot these accurately at distance, and some of the options out there have pull weights so low you can practically breathe on them and they'll go off, though it's really easy to double fire them, not on purpose that way. The choice is going to depend on your personal preference, style of shooting, and how many roles your rifle has to fill. Some people like to set up a dedicated competition and a defensive gun, and some people have one rifle that they use for everything. Personally, I like to keep all my stuff on the more rugged, reliable side regardless of what it's for, rather than trying to eke out every last bit of performance because I prioritize absolute reliability. But mostly I'm lazy about maintenance and I try to clean my guns as little as I have to. Now, you may be wondering what the price point is before we run into diminishing returns. It's about $200. Well, till inflation drives that price up even more. You can get a Larue, a Geissele when they're on sale, some Timney triggers, and a whole bunch of other great options in the $100 to $200 price range. Past that point, you'll definitely feel a difference, especially if you opt for something with a super light pull and an extremely short reset. But for most of us, we won't notice a real-world performance difference. Anyway, thanks for listening, and if you found what I had to say helpful or amusing, please like, share, and subscribe. I've been the 2A Tactical Dad, and as I like to say, we could all be a little more free and a lot more self-reliant. All it takes is a little responsibility.